Okay, so let's get started. We're going to be taking a look at programming our advanced style launch control limiter found within our Link G5 and G4X systems. Last tutorial, we talked about our basic launch control. So where we have just a singular RPM point where we want to go ahead, bring up the engine at the drag strip, get on the rev limiter for our launch control limiter, being able to pop the clutch and launch the car and go down the track. That's simple, basic, and straightforward. But we have the ability with the Link to get really creative with how we implement a launch control limiter. We can effectively create a ground speed limiter, that's terminology from Motec, or you're talking about AEM, it would be a 3-step style limiter. We have the ability to control the vehicle's acceleration in first gear, for example, where traction is definitely less than ideal. So we can use it to not only have a launch RPM point to launch the car at, but then also control how the car accelerates so we don't go into big wheel spin. Now, if you don't want to wire in and set up traction control, this is a decent way to get started getting your vehicle to hook up and go down the drag strip. If you have traction control also enabled, you have at least 2 wheel speed sources, front and rear wheel speeds wired into the Link, you can integrate what we learned in this training module into the traction control. And we're going to talk about how that works when we get to the traction control tutorial and we go through everything, because traction control can be implemented for drag race cars or road race vehicles or any vehicle that wants to be able to have the ability to not go into wheel spin and have the Link being able to control your engine's torque output. But drag racing is very specific because when we launch the car from a stationary stop point, we get a very high calculated wheel slip, or the difference between our driven and undriven wheels. So front wheel drive car, front wheels, that's your driven speed. The rear wheels would be your undriven speed. When we launch, we have a huge amount of generated wheel speed to get going. The rear wheels are barely moving. So we calculate this couple 100% slip. And then as we're moving through most of first gear, that slip is really high. For traction control to really work properly, we need to have a relatively consistent slip in terms for the calculation to perform. So this kind of dynamic situation where we launch the car is very problematic with traction control, which is why we want to work with an advanced launch control like this. And we can bring in a ground speed limiter to be able to get us through at least halfway through first gear or all of first gear, and then we can turn on the traction control. So again, what we learn here, we can expand on that in the traction control tutorial, but we first need to set up everything here for our programming. Let's jump in and take a look at where we can find our launch control and then talk about some of this advanced programming capability. What we're going to do is move from our fuel page and we're going to jump over here to our launch control page. In here, we find we have our launch control window. This is where we want to turn on our 3D style launch limiter table. We're going to go to our launch mode here and grab our 3D launch RPM table. And we're going to say yes, we're going to clear the axes. Now, what we should find here is that our launch RPM table populated. Doesn't look like it did populate, so let's go ahead and unlock the table and click on our grid icon, and now we find the table here is able to be edited. What I'm going to do is unlock this window here, just slide this over here a little bit so I can get a little more room to work with this particular table. We're going to want a little bit more room here, so let's go ahead and just open up the full window for the table and then lock it in place. So now we can see this table is based on throttle position versus driven wheel speed. And we're going to talk about how to set this up specifically for what we want to do here for a ground speed limiter type of function, and also act as a launch control to launch the car. So a couple things we want to keep in mind here. Under the activation control, if we want this to work properly, we're going to set this to always on for this advanced style limiter. So we're going to say always on. The disarming speed, I'm going to set this to 0 mile per hour. What this is going to do is ignore the driven wheel speed. That's going to be the non-powered wheel speed source. That's what it looks for to turn off the launch control feature. So we're going to go and set this to 0. We'll set our TP activation to something low, something like 20-30% is fine for this to work. So we can see right there, we've set our threshold. Arming time, we want it at 0. We want this immediately active when we want this to work. Okay, so the next thing we find here is our fuel trim table option. This is going to allow us to turn on a fuel trim that's applied specifically when we're going in and having the launch limiter starting to work. I'm going to go ahead and turn this on, and I'll show why I want this on in a very specific manner, a reason. This could be for a turbocharged engine. I'll go here to the fuel trim. I'm going to turn it on. and click yes. And we can see here, noticing in both our launch ignition retard window and then our launch fuel trim window, the launch control fuel table populates in both. We'll have to actually fix this here in a little bit. We just obviously want that launch fuel trim to appear here and not here. That just looks like a little software glitch, no big deal. Our launch ignition, we have our launch ignition adjust mode. Currently it's set to single zone. What we want to do here is actually set this to our table option, which is going to bring a three-dimensional table here that we can program. Naturally aspirated and supercharged, we don't really need this three-dimensional option, but for turbocharged, we may potentially need it, which is why I want to go over setting this up here. So let's go to our table option, click OK, click yes. And what you're going to notice here is that it didn't change that launch control fuel. So we're going to have to unlock this window. And then we're going to go down here under our launch ignition retard, double click, and now we can see this is launch control retard. And then this is launch control fuel here. So the fuel and ignition are found in the correct place. Let's go ahead and lock that window down. And then we can find the ignition retard mode will either be degrees absolute or be degrees. Now, I'm going to use degrees for a specific reason to keep this really simple for the programming. So we're going to just click OK here and we'll keep moving on. Degrees allows you to offset the spark timing from whatever you command here in your table. So if you're commanding, let's say full throttle, something like 16 degrees, for example, and I go in and I have -10 in the table, that will then reduce the timing to a total value of 6 degrees. So it's an offset, either adding or subtracting from our base table. The degrees absolute option that we find here that I just mentioned before, degrees absolute will call out the absolute timing you want to run. It'll bypass and override your main spark timing table while the launch control limiter is active. As soon as it turns off, it'll go back to your table values. This is when you're using this for the purpose I'm going to show for a turbocharged engine. It can be confusing changing this to degrees absolute. I'd recommend just changing it to degrees to keep this more simple. So let's click OK. Thanks for checking out our teaser clip. If you want to see the rest of this video and more than 500 hours of current EFI training we have to offer, make sure you click right here. If you want to go and check out more teaser clips from this training course, click here. And you don't want to miss any of the videos we're going to be releasing on this channel, so make sure you subscribe and click here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys later.